Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here. Today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about one of the most ridiculous, useless, and overly complex muscle building concepts that I've ever heard of in my life, and it's been around a really long time, and that's called pre-exhaustion. So let me put on my +5 out of weaponsmithing, work on skilling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. And for those not familiar with pre-exhaustion, it is a training style to where people postulate, oh, let me rephrase this, bodybuilders postulated that in order to remove other muscles becoming a weak link in an exercise, that you pre-exhaust the target muscle first with a smaller exercise, then do a big exercise, right? Because, they were concerned that maybe a closed grip bench press at your pecs or delts could limit the tricep stimulation, or that your quad stimulation could be limited on a squat because of the back and core involvement and everything else. And so the idea is to say do some tricep extensions to fatigue your triceps so that you can jump over and do closed grip bench immediately after, and then guess what? That your triceps will fail before the other muscles, so then they get the most growth stimulation. And it's the same thing like with quads and the squats. Like you do some leg extensions, I guess close to failure, before you get under a barbell squat bar, and then you squat. Now, this is, again, bodybuilder logic. And I think anyone who looks at this, it should become immediately obvious that this is just adding complexity for no benefit. They're adding complexity for no benefit. And what do I mean by that? Well, the reason we do squats is because we want a lot of muscles to grow, right? That's the reason we do a barbell squat. We don't do barbell squats just for our quads, although, arguably it is one of the better quad exercises. But, we're trying to get a lot of things to grow. We do a closed grip bench press because we want our pecs, front delts, and triceps to grow. It's a good exercise for building all of those. And some people would argue that the closed grip bench press is an ideal pec exercise. The problem we get into is this idea that people have that somehow, because other muscles are involved, that it limits the development of a muscle that's a primary mover. And that's just simply not true. That's simply not true. All the primary movers in an exercise grow as a result of doing that exercise if training stimulation is high enough. And it doesn't matter necessarily that you have weak links. In fact, the weak links do sometimes tend to grow a little bit faster on an exercise, but it's not if you've been doing the exercise a long time. Like, let's say you've been doing closed grip bench press for 2 years straight, or the squat for 2 years straight. You don't suddenly have a weak link that needs to be addressed. It is probably grown in proportion while doing the exercise. It's only when you first introduce an exercise, right? Let's say you've never done a chin-up before, but you've done lots of curls, or you've done lots of deadlifts and other stuff for your back, and you've never done a chin-up before. And so let's say that one of those is underdeveloped. Let's say your biceps are overdeveloped, and you've done very, very minimal lat work. Well, yeah, your lats are going to be the limiting factor, right? And your lats are probably going to see a pretty large growth spurt, and your biceps may not get as much at first. But as your back gets stronger and you start moving more weight, then you will start seeing bicep growth. So yeah, for a little while, your biceps might not grow. And then as your back gets bigger and stronger, the whole overload will increase and your biceps will start growing for that exercise. If there was a really, really big disproportion. And by that same token, you would see the same thing. If you had done large amounts of upper back work that didn't involve pulling like this, so if you've done lots and lots of deadlifting and squatting and overhead pressing and all these things that will actually get your back decently big, not as good as a direct lat exercise, but they'll grow it. Your lats might be fairly strong and much stronger than your biceps. And so you might see the same thing occur to where your back might not get that much stimulation. It would get some, it'll grow a little bit, but your biceps will grow faster. But when you've been doing an exercise for a while, this stuff doesn't really happen. It doesn't happen at all. And it's absurd to try to program around that. And the reason it's absurd is because what you're doing is you're just basically doing a compound movement without getting the compound benefit. In other words, if you could normally say squat 315 for 8 reps and you pre-exhaust your quads first, you're not going to squat anywhere near 315 for 8 reps. Right? You're not going to squat anywhere near 315 for 8 reps. You're just going to have a lower load. It might drop down to 225. I'm just throwing that out there. I'm not saying that's exactly what it's going to be. You see the problem there? Are your quads going to get any more development from that fatigued set of 8? And if you had gone with them fresh with 8? In other words, squatting to failure is squatting to failure. Those last few reps, you're going to get a growth stimulus in your quads, and it's not going to be any stronger than if you had done the full 315 with the same RPE, right? If you'd done the full thing with the full RPE. So what you end up getting is probably, maybe, arguably, similar amounts of quad development, but everything else is going to get less growth. In other words, you're not going to get the hamstring, the glute, the ab, the back, the thoracic erector, the spinal erector, all this stuff out of the squat that you would have gotten, and all you're getting is the quad stimulation. So the question becomes, why did you bother to subject yourself to a squat? Wouldn't it have just been easier to just do the leg extensions, if you really for some reason felt you needed to isolate your quads? I'm not saying I recommend leg extensions, by the way. I don't think they're a good exercise. That's my opinion. But it's ridiculous, and it's the same thing on the closed grip bench press. Is another example of it. Like, why? Do you really think that your triceps are going to grow more because now you've used a much, much lighter load on a big compound? No, they're not going to get any more stimulation than if you had done it fresh, because it's still going to be a closed grip press, that movement pattern with a given RPE, and your triceps are fatigued, and you reach a similar level of fatigue there. It's not going to make them grow any more than if you had just done a normal set of closed grip bench press. But what you are going to see is you're going to lose the benefits of the big compound movement. You're not going to get the pectoral and the delt stimulation because you did not tax them meaningfully. So by pre-exhausting it, you actually are losing all the benefits of the compound. You basically just did a drop set on an isolation movement, right? And when this has been looked at, and I don't have a study handy, this is stuff I saw years and years ago. They did a study on this to see which caused more muscle growth, even in the target muscle, right? To do them in the big movement first, and then to follow up with a smaller movement versus the smaller movement then the big movement. And I think it's pretty obvious what happened. The other way did produce more muscle growth. And I don't remember what it was. It was a pretty small difference, but the muscle growth was slightly superior from doing the compound movement first, followed by the isolation movement second, in the target muscle that we're talking about. In the target muscle we're talking about. And then what do you think happened in all the other muscles? It should be pretty obvious. The big movement first produced way more overall muscle growth. So the ridiculousness of this is that people do stuff like this with this whole idea of trying to isolate muscles, which we've discussed isn't necessarily ideal. And so they'll do the smaller movement than the bigger movement. They shortchange themselves overall growth. They shortchange themselves overall development. And if anything, hell, you're possibly putting yourself at a higher risk of injury because now you've got a weak link and a smaller muscle in there that's fatigued, connective tissue fatigue. I'm not seeing where it may not even be safer, and I could be wrong on that one. I could be absolutely wrong. I'll just admit that. I just see the potential for a higher injury risk there. And here's what just makes more sense. There's a reason we add smaller movements in. We add smaller movements in because sometimes we need to address a weak point. We need to address a function of a muscle, or we need to address a weak point in a muscle. Because if it wasn't a function issue, we would just do more closed grip bench pressing, for example, if we wanted bigger triceps, right? You would never bother with a skull crusher. You would just keep doing more closed grip bench press. But oftentimes, sometimes with the big movement, we might be missing a function of the muscle. Maybe we're not getting that shoulder movement that's involved that we need to get the long head of the tricep. So you go ahead and you add another movement in to help that lagging muscle grow and to stimulate it in a slightly different way than the big movement is, by doing a slightly smaller movement. Maybe it addresses a function of the muscle a little bit differently. And there's a place for that, so I'm not against that concept. Even though I'm not big on isolation, I will admit that there are cases to where a big movement might not address all performance elements, and therefore maybe a certain head or some of the muscle fibers in a lagging muscle are not being fully addressed as much as we might like, in which case maybe that smaller movement is going to help bring up that lagging muscle a little bit. And there's certainly nothing wrong with that concept if you use it intelligently. But it makes sense to do the smaller movement after because you want the benefits. We squat because we want 50% of our body to grow from it, right? We're trying to get bigger. We're trying to get stronger. And then maybe you need to add some extra work for something lagging in there. Okay, that's fine, but add the extra work at the end. There's certainly a reasonable case to be made for that. But we do these exercises because we want all these muscles to grow, right? And it's just ludicrous to do it the other way. It doesn't even work. And like I said, even the limited studies that looked at it found that it wasn't particularly effective. And all it does is shortchange overall growth. And hell, if you really think that you have a muscle that needs more work, such as, again, you're going to do a tricep extension and then do a closed grip bench press after, why not just do a second set of tricep extensions? In other words, if you're not trying to get the benefit of the big compound movement of getting all these muscles involved, why not just do 2 sets of tricep extensions? You're already set up for it. You don't have to use 2 different things. You can have the bench press already free and just do your tricep extensions. There's no need to do this. There's no added benefit to doing that instead of a second set of tricep extensions. And why are you doing the tricep extensions? Because maybe they add some benefit that the big movement doesn't. They might work the muscle in a slightly different way. If you better be picking ones that work in a different way, or else it's wasting your time. You should just be doing the big movement. So it's really wasted potential because you're doing the tricep extension possibly because maybe the long head isn't getting as much recruitment as you want from a closed grip bench. So it would make a hell of a lot more sense and you would get a lot more overall benefit if you just went ahead and did a second set of the tricep extension instead of trying to do this pre-exhaustion nonsense. Because here's what we also know. This is basically just short rest time training too. What's all the data on rest time shown? That oftentimes longer rest times allow you to move more weight and do more work and produce slightly superior muscle growth in multiple studies looking at it. So you're shortchanging yourself all the way around. It's just a ridiculous ass backwards way to train. The research doesn't support it. Common sense doesn't support it. Yet people still do this stuff. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.